Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really thankful you're able to be with us. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to thank you all. I'm going to have Ruth Ann take over from here, and she's going to do a quick welcome and introduction.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to our third annual Day of Remembrance program. I'm here with our special guests, Sam Mihara, Nico Abe, and the Honorable Hideo Fukushima, and I'll introduce them a little bit more in a few minutes. I'm Ruth Ann Hattori, Marketing Director for the National Museum of the Pacific War, and I'll be moderating a conversation among our guests today. First, I'd like to provide some historical context for what we will be discussing. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and as a result, the US entered World War II. 3 months later, on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the government to declare areas of the country as to what they called military zones, and from which they stated, and I quote, "Any or all persons may be excluded," end quote. As it turned out, only those of Japanese ancestry were the ones excluded. About 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them were American citizens, were subjected to mandatory evacuation from these military zones, which were on the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington. They had to abandon their homes, their jobs, and they lost their freedom as they were forced into internment camps. The government maintained that the executive order was to protect the evacuees, but the treatment of internees in those camps did not reinforce that claim. It's important to note that Executive Order 9066 actually enabled the government to take action against any individuals or groups, not just Japanese Americans. So until the order was rescinded in 1976 by President Gerald Ford, any group of us, by ethnic origin or national origin, by the locale of our residences or any designation, could have suffered the same fate. In 1988, almost 50 years after the internment of those 120,000 people, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, which cited grave injustices against Japanese Americans. The act also directed $1.6 billion in reparations to be paid to those internees or their heirs. So on this National Day of Remembrance, we're here to reflect on what happened to those who were interned. Our guests today are Sam Mihara, who as a child was interned at Heart Mountain Relocation Camp in Wyoming, and who has spent the last decade or so going around the country speaking on this topic. We really welcome Sam and his infinite knowledge on this. Nico Abe, Nico, give us a wave, a film student whose grandfather was a witness to the attack on Pearl Harbor and whose grandmother was interned during World War II. Last year, Nico created a short film about his grandparents' World War II experience. And the Honorable Hideo Fukushima, who is the Japanese Consul General in Houston, who's going to provide us with a totally different perspective, that of about the relationship between Japan and the US after World War II. Jacqueline Mertz is also here, who is the Public Programs Coordinator here at the museum, and she will be facilitating the Q&A later in the program. We do invite everyone to submit your questions using the chat feature, and you can do that throughout the program. Jacqueline will be monitoring the questions, and we'll try to offer as many of them as possible during the Q&A. So let's get started. We're going to start with a pre-recorded video from the Consul General. But as you can see, he is here with us, and so he will be live with us for the Q&A. And so here is the video.
Thank you for having me to speak in this Day of Remembrance program on the history of Japanese Americans, or Nikkei people, during the Pacific War. I want to thank Director Cartier, and the other museum staff for promoting accurate understanding of the history of the war and providing the opportunity for such a wide range of people to consider its valuable lessons. This year, 2021, is a major milestone as the 80th anniversary of the start of the Pacific War. As such, I think it is a great opportunity to once again dwell on the history of the war and the important lessons we can learn from it. Today's focus, the internment of Japanese Americans, or Nikkei people, was one of the war's notable tragedies. Despite being Americans born in the United States, Nikkei people were treated as spies with suspect loyalties from the outbreak of the war. For years, they endured unimaginable pain and difficulties as their lives were swallowed by the historic tidal waves of the war. This history must be studied carefully so that we can properly understand its lessons and firmly pledge to prevent militarism, racial prejudice, and a disregard for basic human rights from returning once again. I believe that such a pledge has been fundamental to the strong post-war US-Japan alliance. Last year, 2020, was a different milestone that marked 60 years since the revised US-Japan Security Treaty was signed. At its signing in 1960, President Eisenhower famously said the treaty would establish an indestructible partnership between Japan and the United States. Why were our two nations able to forge such strong bonds only 15 short years after the war? Simply put, it was because we share unwavering commitment to the core values of democracy, human rights, and the rules-based international order. President George W. Bush, himself a close friend of Japan, often said that Japan is like no other nation because it has become such a close ally after once being a foe. Indeed, the Japan-US alliance has grown to become the cornerstone of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, due to the tireless efforts made by the many great people of both countries. Recently, I was saddened by the news that one such great man, former Secretary of State George Shultz, has passed away. Secretary Shultz made many significant contributions to the US-Japan alliance. When I started as a Japanese diplomat during the Reagan administration, his acts and deeds showed me what was truly important in diplomacy. Nowhere is this clearer than in his motto, "Trust is the coin of the realm." By taking the lessons of the war to heart, Japan and the United States have built the indestructible partnership President Eisenhower envisioned on the bedrock of such deep mutual trust. I sincerely hope and believe that today's Remembrance Day program will further reinforce this foundation of trust by teaching the history and retelling the stories of Japanese Americans during the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Consul General, for that video. It really sets the stage for where we are today. And while we are commemorating this Day of Remembrance to honor the internees of World War II, there is much to celebrate about our relationship, the relationship between Japan and the US today. Thank you. So now I'd like to start a multi-generational conversation with our two other guests. My mother was actually also interned during World War II in British Columbia. So the three of us represent three generational perspectives on the Japanese internment experience. So let's start with you, Sam. What do you remember about finding out that your family would be evacuated and interned, and how did your parents react to that news?
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to answer that. Let me give you a very brief background on my parents, and especially my father. My father was extremely well educated in Japan. He graduated from Waseda University with a degree in English. And therefore, he was really good at both English and Japanese, and he immigrated and found a job at a newspaper in San Francisco. And he became very good, and he was promoted to be the editor. So now he is a leader of the community, and he has access to information, being in the newspaper business. So when the war began, he was suspected of being a friend of the enemy, that that there may be something like an internment process going. I remember when the news hit about the imprisonment of Japanese. I remember the newspaper headlines, and I remember the billboard half a block from my house, that stated, quote, "Bye bye, Japs." That was awful. But that's the kind of hate, and that's the kind of local bias that happened, that led to a decision by our leaders to remove us. So I remember when that happened, my reaction was to my parents. Why is this going on? And my father could not answer. He simply reacted that why would Japan do such a thing as Pearl Harbor, and why would they suspect the local Japanese, especially those of us who were American citizens, to be suspected? And so the reaction was simply a shock, and not understanding why our race would be suspected, because a similar reaction was not given to the local German and Italian families. So that's a little bit of a long answer, but that's the answer to the question, our parents' reaction. They were totally surprised.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Nico, I know that you provided us with a clip of your grandmother talking about how she found out that her family would be interned. So Jacqueline, if you could play that now, and then we'll talk to Nico afterwards.
I didn't think of it as war as I grew up. All I know is that we had to move away from where we were and had to go someplace else. My father, he didn't talk about it as a war, but more as we have to, the whole family has to move out. So we had to leave the house. I remember when my father told us we had to move, we only had a few days. And he said, we don't have all the orders, however, in the dining room, round big maple table, we all sat around there, and he told us that we have to move in a few days, can only carry what we can. And since my sister and I were small, he had said, hang on to Mama's skirt and don't let go, because if you let go, we won't be able to find you. So it was that we couldn't really help with the move other than to hang on to Mama's skirt and follow everybody. But he said that there's going to be a lot of people, so we have to be careful. I didn't know where we were going until after. Then everybody told us we were in Minidoka.
Thanks, Nico. And I will say I have seen Nico's entire film, and it is really a wonderful film. And in fact, the Abe family was kind enough to let us at the museum use excerpts of the film last year in our VJ Day program. So thank you for that, Nico. Nico, how did you find out about your grandmother's internment experience, and how did you react when you found out?
Yeah, so I was in middle school. I was about 11 years old, and we had just learned about the Japanese internment in my history class. And so I had what's it called, dinner with my grandparents later that evening, and I asked them about like the Japanese internment if they knew anything about it, and my grandmother told me that yeah, like I was in it. And so I was a little shocked at that, and I was surprised that I had like this connection with history, and that the fact that someone in my family had actually experienced this. And so she actually pulled out this box, and she whipped out all these documents that basically stated like her ID number, where like all these maps and a lot of the documents were collected like post-war, so it was a lot of like museum stuff, but it also included like she had like I think 2 images of the actual camp, and it was very interesting to hear her perspective because she was about 4 years old when she was taken to the camp, and so she had it from a child's perspective, and she actually didn't know about the war until about like halfway through when she watched the Sullivan Brothers movie, and that kind of told her that like this was going on and this is why they were interned. But she had a more innocent perspective on the war, so it wasn't as, to sort of say, um, it wasn't as heartbreaking as the amount of, when she was explaining to me the story, like the amount of stress her family must have been feeling was must have been like shocking. Like I can't even imagine what they could have been going through. But yeah, my reaction was pretty much just shock and awe that my family had been through something like this, that they they had lived through something as terrible as this.
Thank you. In my family, my mother was actually about 18 when her family had to go to camp, and they lived in a small town south of Vancouver, BC. And so they were sent to the mountains, but it was, for as long as I can remember, it was just a fact of life in our family that had happened to her family. And I don't really recall any particular reaction that she mentioned about finding out about that. Sam, what do you remember about arriving at Heart Mountain, and what was your first impression, and what were you thinking at that time?
Sure. The way we got to Heart Mountain, I first we rode a train. It was what I would call a prison train, and it went from San Francisco to Pomona, which is a temporary camp in Southern California, converted from a horse racetrack. And then we rode a train from Pomona to Heart Mountain. It took about 3 days. Again, the train had these guards with weapons, rifles at each entrance to the cars. Some 500 of us. We finally stopped at a small siding, which is a small place where the trains can stop. And we got out. We were greeted by more guards from the Heart Mountain camp. And we got on back of these army trucks, and we went into the camp through the main gate. And I saw the barbed wire fences. I saw guard towers. There were 9 guard towers along the perimeter fence, and there are signs that says, "Stop, do not escape, or you can be shot." And it was in both English and Japanese. Then the truck took us to our barrack, and we were placed into, our whole family, 4 of us, placed into a small room, which had barely enough room for 4 beds and not much else. There was no utility, no water, no electricity in the room. There was 1 light bulb in the ceiling. The toilets were half a block away, and all it was 10 toilet seats being used to serve 300 prisoners. and no partitions. It was very, very embarrassing. I remember the food was, I would call it prison food at the start: bread, potatoes, powdered milk, and pickled vegetables. And so it was extremely difficult. Um, and in my longer program, I usually talk about the details of especially the medical care or lack thereof. But those are the conditions that we had when I arrived at Heart Mountain.
Hmm. Nico, what did your grandmother tell you about their family's arrival at the camp and her reaction?
Yeah. So my grandmother was actually taken, so she lived in Seattle before the war. And so because she lived in Seattle, she was taken to, and she was one of the first people, one of the first groups of people to be taken to the internment camp. So she was taken to the Puyallup Fairgrounds, which would turn into the Harmony camp. And she tells me about how like that day they had to stay in the horse stables, and like her father had to collect hay to just set up to, so then they had something to lie down on in the at night. And she told me that one, and it was only one day that they stayed there. The next day they would have gone off to Minidoka, but that night she had left, I think, to go find a toy or something like that. And as she was reaching the edge of the camp, like she ran into a soldier, and the soldier like pointed his gun at her, started yelling at her. And so like she told me that was like the most terrified she's ever been. That singular day at the Puyallup Fairgrounds was the worst day of her entire internment. But
Hmm.
eventually she would have been taken to Minidoka by via train. And she told me that when she arrived there, it was very windy, very barren, very dusty, very cold, and it wasn't fully finished. It wasn't fully built yet. So she was assigned the barracks, and her family went over there, and her father didn't actually have the keys to go in, so they had to wait in the cold, sitting on their sea packs, I think they're called. They're like the bags that they were given from the military to put all their stuff in. And she basically just had to wait there until her father in the cold and windy and dust to wait for her father to be able to get into the camp. But she said that the beginning was miserable, but like again, she was from, it was from a child's perspective, so she made the most she could out of it. And she was kind of like more on the sidelines than her family, which again must have been extremely stressful to move into a new place like a camp. And essentially she told me that it would eventually get better. Like they would start building like putting up blankets, so then they were kind of acted as walls inside the barracks, and started making gardens, and they started making it livable given the conditions, making it the best that they could have.
Hmm. Most of the camps in Canada were quite different than the ones in the US. You know, the ones in the US, if you've seen pictures of them, and in fact, Charity, Jacqueline, can you share any of Sam's pictures of Heart Mountain? What I was going to say about the Canadian camps is that many of them were in kind of abandoned mining towns. And so it was a lot different than this barrack style of camp that all of the US camps represented. Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit about this photo?
Yeah, you're looking at a photo of Heart Mountain in the background. That's the reason why they call it Heart Mountain. Is more or less shaped like a heart. But you're looking at some 450 barracks, all identical. Each barrack had 6 rooms, and each room was a little bit different size to accommodate anywhere from small families like a couple all the way up to 7 people in the largest room. And it was a very, very difficult conditions. The winters were horrible, minus 28 degrees in the first winter. And those of us from California, we just weren't ready for it. We didn't bring the right clothing, and it was an extremely difficult time for us.
Hmm. Yeah, in contrast, as I understand it, the camp where my mother's family was sent was an old mining town in the mountains of British Columbia. And while I'm sure it was quite cold there as well, There were plenty of buildings and houses that were still left in town. And so the internees occupied those houses and buildings, and there were still some residents there. And it turned out that they just became part of the town. So it was quite a different experience in that sense. Sam, how did being interned affect the rest of your lives, yours and your families? And, you know, from then on, but also in reflection today?
Well, when we returned back from camp to California, the degree of hate that existed was worse than when we left. People had difficulties. They lost homes. They lost their jobs. They lost businesses, and it was an extremely difficult time for most people of Japanese ancestry who returned from the camp. And so I remember, especially in our family, my father kept stressing the value of education because he went through it, and his education in Japan at Waseda University helped immensely for him to survive. And so I remember he kept emphasizing that and I was getting ready for high school, that most important is to get a good education. So I went to a good high school, and I went to Berkeley for undergraduate and UCLA graduate school. And I became an engineer, became a rocket scientist. I worked for the Boeing company for 42 years, had a great career. Uh, and so what lesson I learned after I retired from Boeing is that I thought it would be very helpful for people to learn what happened to us, because I found out that not many people, especially young people, are being taught about what really happened and why it happened, and the fact that it could happen again to others. And so I'm now doing that full time. I enjoy it. I speak all over the country, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to educate others on what happened.
Yeah, that's great. Nico, how do you think the internment impacted your grandparents' lives? And then how did they communicate that? And do you think that there was anything different about the way your parents and you were raised as a result of it?
Yeah, definitely. My grandmother doesn't really talk about much about like the prejudice that she faced. However, she did mention when she returned, like there was a while she was in class, there was a Japanese kid, and he didn't really fully understand English that well. And after the teacher was kind of like the teacher kept on asking him a question, and he didn't fully understand, and so she walked over to him and like shook him and kind of started yelling at him. And that was kind of to the full extent of what she told me about her stories when she came back. However, when my grandparents got married and they went to San Francisco, when they moved to San Francisco, they faced a good amount of racism there as they were looking for an apartment. And so they would call ahead and ask them like, oh, is it still available? And they would say yes. And as soon as they showed up, they'd say no, it's taken, like we don't want you. And so it took them a while to find an apartment. But the way it affected my life and my parents' lives, I think there was a need to assimilate to American culture rather than like be Japanese, because we didn't want this to happen again. We wanted to be seen as Americans, not as foreigners, so to say.
Mhm.
And so my father never learned Japanese, and my grandparents know Japanese, but he never learned it as he there. I believe my grandparents' goal for my father and my uncles were to try and make them as American as possible, to just allow them to become Americans. And I personally have felt this as well. I've felt the need to kind of assimilate into American society, but I haven't really been in touch with my Japanese culture, but ever since I've learned about it, I've been a lot more aware of being in touch with my roots, my culture here in America, learning a lot about like HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and more about the Japanese internment in college, especially.
Well, you both touched on a couple things that I remember from growing up as well. Sam, you mentioned about education, and I will say that I grew up in Denver, and we have a very small Japanese American community there, but I do not know one family who did not think that they were going to send their kids to college. I mean, I think that that was a hugely important thing to Japanese Americans, to be sure that their children's success would hopefully prevent some bad things from happening to them in the future. And then, as you said, Nico, this whole notion of assimilation was also really prominent, I think, in the Japanese American community in and around Denver, that that, you know, we considered ourselves first Americans, and it's not specifically that they were rejecting a Japanese culture, but they were certainly intent on assimilation in that sense. So yeah, I think those are two big themes as we all grew up. I wanted to just tell everyone a little bit about my mother's point of view. Was really quite somewhat optimistic. After the war in Canada, apparently the Canadian government, first of all, the Canadian government did pay reparation immediately after the war, and then again, many years later. But they gave the internees the option of either going east somewhere, and several of my aunts did go to Ontario. But the other option was that they could go to Japan. And my mother decided to accompany her older brother, who needed some eye surgery over there. So she and two of her sisters went to Japan after the war, and they actually got jobs as interpreters on a US Army base there. But in terms of her experience in the camps, she maintained forever that the camp experience for them had not been so terrible as what she's heard about American camps, but also that she would have never been a teacher, nor certainly a principal. She became, towards the end of the war, she became the principal of one of the camp schools. And she said she would have never had that experience had it not been for internment. She also commented, and I thought this was kind of interesting for a 1940s, 20-some-year-old young woman to say, that she had quite an adventure hitchhiking around British Columbia after they were released from the camp, because of course they didn't have anything, they didn't have any transportation. So I do credit my mom with being quite an optimist about, you know, kind of making lemonade out of lemons, I guess you could say, about her internment experience. So Jacqueline, I would love to open it up for Q&A now, unless, actually, I would like to, before we do that, I'd like to ask Mr. Fukushima, what did you learn as you grew up about not only the American internee situation, but also I am aware that there were Americans interned in Japan during the war, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. I must say that I'm not quite knowledgeable about the specific situation of American internees, but definitely, but that should be the case. And about the history of this internment camp in United States, I think, not, including me, more and more Japanese people are becoming aware of this history. And given that, particularly ever since this big movement occurred in the 80s and 90s, initiated by the Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and those political leaders made a certain movement. But I would say that those knowledge is not deep enough, not deep enough. In the sense that you know, still many people think that that's something that occurred internally, in the United States
Mhm, mhm.
social situation and disregard for human rights and racial prejudice and so on and so forth. And many people, in my opinion, many, particularly education is not enough for younger generation for them to know that, this very root cause of this internment situation comes back to militarism of Japan. And, if no Pearl Harbor, no internment. So that kind of big picture, in my opinion, there needs to be a still more education for Japanese people, particularly younger generation.
Mhm. Yeah, that's here too, yes. So Jacqueline, why don't we open it up for Q&A, and if you want to take it away?
Sure thing. So we have our first question from Ezeki Barrera, and they ask, do we believe another similar order like Executive Order 9066 can occur in the future? So this is open to, why don't we start off with Sam?
Well, my answer is absolutely yes. I really believe it can happen again. When you have a combination of some factors that led to our imprisonment, that being racial hatred, the hysteria, especially driven by the media, who portrays a race as dangerous, and you have some of the leaders in this country who believe that it's appropriate to remove us and put us into prison. When you have that combination, the likelihood is it'll happen again. And if you look at some of the events that have happened more recently, well, even during World War II, it could have happened to Germans and it could have happened to Italians. But the government decided in the case of, so I have some good friends in San Francisco who are Italians. You may recognize the name DiMaggio, Joe DiMaggio. Their family was my neighbor. And they decided to keep them at home, but don't let them go close to the bay where they can watch the ships going in and out. When they do that, the government is not violating the Constitution. You're allowed to stay home. You're allowed to continue your livelihood and just limit your access to sensitive areas. That would have been a much better solution in the case of the Japanese. And so when hysteria takes over and when you have some leaders who disregard our rights under the Constitution, you wind up with problems like we had during World War II.
What about you, Nico? Do you believe do you think there could be a similar order in the future?
As much as I'd like to say that history likes to repeat itself, I personally don't think that another Order 9066 would happen unless we went into like martial law, because like we have, as a country, we've learned, we've changed a lot of things. We had the civil rights movement, we've had a lot of minorities have come to like have voices now, and in our political climate, it's a little bit more difficult to single out a minority, especially right now, and especially with like the Geneva Convention. You can't blame someone, like you can't blame a group of people for the actions of one person. So I personally think that it probably won't happen again unless we had to go into martial law where the president has to take over. But given, like, I think we can measure it as a matter of national security versus our individual rights. And if we look at it as the national security was the war back then, we could relate it to today and say that like terrorism is the biggest threat to national security today. And so we aren't exactly seeing, like with Muslim immigrants right now, we aren't exactly seeing like them being interned or anything. We are just seeing a lot more, or I shouldn't say that, but there are a lot more defenses for the Muslim immigrants that are coming in now,
Okay.
especially from the minorities.
So Kim and Zeke also asked about how can we best prevent something similar like this from happening?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I think education is the most important. If we can teach people and people learn about the facts of what really happened, the injustice, the inhumane treatment of a race or any group, uh, that's the key. And to teach about the significance of the Constitution to make sure that our leaders will honor our civil rights. That's what's important. And more people who are educated, the better we'll be in the future.
Nico, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just education. That's the best way. When I learned about the internment in my middle school, it was just literally like a tiny section of the textbook. It wasn't a whole lot, and it didn't really do anything justice until I went to my grandparents and actually talked to them about it. Like it basically said that we were interned, and that was that.
Okay. David Baylor had the privilege of visiting Heart Mountain in 2016, and he learned a lot about some of the men were able to work outside in the surrounding communities. So Sam, he wants to ask about did your father happen to be involved in any of that work outside of the community, like agriculture?
No, and you're talking about the conditions in the camp itself, or were you talking about after? I'm sorry.
During the camp.
Yeah, during the camp. No, I didn't mention. My father went blind in camp. He had glaucoma, and there were no specialists who knew how to take care of it. He was not allowed to return to California to see a specialist, so he went blind, and he never saw again. Once he entered Heart Mountain, he became blind. He returned. He lost his job for obvious reasons, and it was a very, very difficult time. And so, but again, thanks to his fundamental education he had in Japan, he was able to make a living by teaching and writing. He can do that by being blind, while being blind, and he was able to do that very successfully. And so that's how we survived. And that's what I like to tell that story about the significance of getting a good education to be useful to society, and at the same time make sure you honor the civil rights that are given to all of us. That's very, very important.
Jacqueline, I do have a comment about that question. So my father's family was from southeastern Colorado, the San Luis Valley. And there was actually an internment camp there, about 10 miles from my grandparents' farm. And so they were put in kind of an awkward position because they did in fact hire day laborers from the camp. And I think it's really sad to think that at the end of each day, those day laborers had to go back to the barbed wire fences and into the camp, while my family was fortunate enough to be the farmers, and they got to go home, to their farmhouse, just like all the rest of the farmers in the valley. So it was a very weird situation for them. But yes, those internees were able to go outside the camp as day laborers.
Okay. This one is for Nico. This is from Willie Williams. He asks, what did you see in the behavior of your fellow students towards you as you studied the internment in class as you were growing up?
Yeah, so I wasn't exactly like the school I went to was predominantly Asian. It was like I believe our school was like 40% Asian. So it was not exactly like not people we didn't exactly pay too much attention to it, I should say. Is we kind of went over it in class, and then we like some of us were curious about it and we asked more questions, but there wasn't a whole lot to be said about it. And it's just a matter of the fact that we didn't really have a whole lot of or we didn't have a whole lot to say, or the textbooks and the teachers didn't really have a whole lot to say about Japanese internment other than the one section that there was on it. It wasn't until like around when I started entering college and started taking all these Asian American studies classes where I started learning about like the deeper inside of Japanese internment and Asian American history.
What about you, Ruth Ann, as you were growing up and learning about internment camps in school? What was
You
your
know, I don't actually recall learning anything in school about that. And in fact, you know, my husband, who grew up in Sacramento, California, reports the same thing. He's actually Caucasian. And he told me that he didn't even know about the internment, which, you know, really, he was right there in the middle of it. He didn't know anything about it until he got a job when he was in high school. At a local hotel, and he happened to work for a chef who had been interned, and that's how he learned about it. And in my recollection, I don't think that we learned about it in school either in Colorado.
Okay. This question is from Mark Roche. Sorry. They also got the chance to visit Heart Mountain, and they understood that a lot of internees received draft notices, and many of those refused service. And he was wondering if you could address that issue and what became those who refused to serve.
Yeah, sure. It is a fact that first the government requested volunteers to join the military while we were there. Then when they needed more, they decided to have a draft. About 800 out of 10,000 at Heart Mountain joined the military. There was a group of about 80 who resisted on the principle that my civil rights were being taken away, my family's locked up. Why should I serve the military for the same government? And so they went to trial, the federal trial, the largest trial ever held in Wyoming. And all of them were found guilty and sent to regular federal prisons. And one of them is a very close friend of mine, Dr. Takashi Hoshizaki. And that was his principle. He talks about it in his speeches that, well, you know, why should I serve a government when the government locks up my family and we're all denied our basic rights? And so he felt comfortable in that decision. He was 18 years old when he made that decision and went to a regular federal prison. And so all of these, 80 of them have spent their time in the prison. They were finally given a pardon by President Harry Truman. And so the records were clear. Many of them, by the way, went on to serve this government during the Korean War. It wasn't a question of not willing to serve. It was a question of restoring their civil rights.
Okay. So this will be our third to last question. This is from Brad Imarua. So if education is key, has FDR's role in violating the Constitution and the civil rights of over 100,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry through Executive Order 9066 been accurately presented in our nation's schools? And if not, why not? Nico,
Maybe
Yeah.
Nico, maybe you can answer
Yeah.
that because you went through the school.
Yeah. I can't exactly say why it's not accurately presented in our education, but it definitely should be more what do you call it? Much of a more touched subject in our schools. But given the fact that we were learning more about World War II, it was probably they probably didn't want to demonize FDR. However, it is more important that we do learn like the truth of history and are allowed to create our own decisions and make our own opinions. So I personally believe that it should be talked about a lot more. However, in our education system right now, it's not.
Yeah, I think that actually, if you think about who writes the history books, they're people. And I think the system, as Nico says, in this country is that, you know, as a historian, you choose the things that are going to be put in your book. And so you can elect to either minimize things or omit things entirely. I think that if you asked African Americans, you know, did they think that slavery is taught fairly in school, they would probably argue with that in most cases as well. And again, I think it's because as authors, you do get to choose what's going to be in your book. And then the next layer, of course, is that school districts get to choose the textbook they want to use. So there's no standard. There's no real standard that exists about what should be taught and, you know, what is mandatory to be taught or even what should be taught.
Right. So our second to last question is one we want to ask the Consul General. And it's about your perspective on how the American government and or society have learned from the internment of the Japanese Americans. How do you think our society and our government now have learned from what happened back then?
Well, thank you, Jacqueline. It's a kind of a tricky, difficult question for me as a diplomat. I'm not, well, you know that I'm not in a position to make any critical comment about the social policy of any other country. But well, all I can say is that well, it seemed to took such a long time before the U.S. government admitted the mistake, right? You know, after the end of the war, maybe more than 50 years. But well, congressman used to say that it's never too late to correct a mistake, and it takes a certain, you know, it's a brave thing to admit you know, past mistake, but that's done by the political leaders of the U.S. So on that aspect, I really admire U.S. Political justice eventually being done, and that's substantiated by the huge resilience of U.S. democracy. You know, people's power, people's you know, politics are listening to the voices of the people, and the politics move. So that's how the political system and democracy in the U.S. works. And on that account, I quite admire the system, and there's something that Japan should emulate from this experience and lessons.
Great. And then this kind of goes to the other panelist as well, is the lessons that the government and society have learned that we can put now, and you know, from what we learned back then.
You know, I'd like to think about the lessons learned in terms of the parameters of the decision that was made in 1942. Whenever you have a situation of a combination of hate and the hysteria and the leaders who decide against the constitutional rights, be careful. Those are the conditions that makes it ripe for other groups to be affected. For example, before he passed away, Justice of the Supreme Court, Scalia, made the statement that I would not be surprised if it happens again under the similar conditions. I don't believe in it should be done, but when you have that combination of factors, you know, be careful because it could happen again. And I think that's the kind of a lesson we all need to remember that it might happen to other groups, other people, and we need to be careful about that.
Yeah, fear is a very strong emotion that can be manipulated very very harshly to affect the people of America. But like I said, I think we have as a country have learned a lot since World War II. It's been nearly what 70 years, and it's I think yeah the way that we have to we have to move forward in our education. We have to be a lot more progressive. We have a lot more minority voices that are being heard now. So there's a lot more resistance than there was before.
I think that fear and hysteria are two factors that we can't judge, prejudge the effects of. And I think that the advent of social media is a huge factor in how fear and hysteria, get spread. So I think it's quite unpredictable. I would love to believe that these things can't happen again, and hope and certainly would wish that we could have better education so that people could feel like they know the reasons why these things shouldn't happen. But in the absence of that, in the shorter term, I am concerned about whether fear and hysteria and the lack of education today could drive something to happen.
Okay. Well, I think we are up. We have run out of time. And so I want to thank everyone for participating, Nico, Sam, Counsel General, and Anne. It has been quite an enlightening conversation. And I thank everyone who has joined us this afternoon for your questions and for your participation. We will be sending out an email within the next couple of days. There is a survey attached, so please fill out that survey. We'd love to get some feedback from you all. And everyone have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.